think we might get started. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Stand Up for Your Rights webinar series, which tonight we are going to be focusing on accessing services on digital platforms. My name is Jess, and I'm going to be your facilitator for tonight. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land. Today I am on Aboriginal land, and I want to acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past, present and those emerging, and to all the Aboriginal community that continue to care for our country. I stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language and history, and a continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights, paving the way for a strong future. So tonight we have a lot of useful information to get through in relation to barriers that you may have faced when accessing services or information in the digital space, and what to do when you do face them. So a little more specifically, we're going to look at skills to help you navigate digital services using adaptive technology and steps you can take when you can't access an app or website. We're going to look at the standards and guidelines which indicate what you can reasonably expect by way of accessibility. And we're also going to hear a little bit about Vision Australia's recent smartphone research, which is designed to support our advocacy in the digital space. I do want to quickly acknowledge that while tonight's webinar does focus on online accessibility, we don't have time to give advice related to specific accessibility issues with apps or websites or devices. If you are experiencing a specific technical issue, please feel free to contact Vision Australia's AT Help Desk, which is at athelp@visionaustralia.org. That's athelp@visionaustralia.org, or you can ring through on 1300 847 466. So now that we're through all of that, I'm going to introduce the panelists, and we've got some really great people with us tonight with a lot of expertise in this area. So we have Bruce McGuire, Damien McMorrow and Matt Potland, and I'm going to get them to introduce themselves, starting with you, Bruce.
Thank you, Jess, and good evening, everyone. As Jess said, I'm Bruce McGuire. My role at Vision Australia is lead policy advisor. I'm totally blind, and I've been using screen readers of one kind or another for over 30 years, firstly in DOS and then in Windows, a bit of VMS along the way. Haven't delved much into Linux, but that's maybe for the future. Before I joined Vision Australia, I worked in the Disability Rights Unit at the Australian Human Rights Commission. So over the years, I think I've seen the good and the bad and the ugly when it comes to web and app accessibility, and I'm looking forward to sort of talking tonight, particularly about the smartphone research that we've done in conjunction with Curtin University. Back to you, Jess.
Great, thank you so much, Bruce. And Damo, over to you.
Yeah, hi, Jess. Good evening, folks. Damo is my name, Access Technology Manager at Vision Australia. I'm totally blind and therefore a screen reader user, and have been since the early 80s, the days of the Tandy TRS-80, for those that are old enough to remember those. So over the years, worked in most of my working life in the technology industry, some parts of it in assistive tech and some parts of it in the mainstream IT industry in the education sector. And like Bruce, over the years, I've I guess struggled with systems and sites that were inaccessible at times, you know, I've sort of seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. I've also, because of the job that I do have a passion for accessible technologies and the fantastic opportunities that they can create for people in our position.
Great, thanks so much, Damo. And Matt, finally.
Thanks, Jess. I'm Matthew Potland. I'm a digital accessibility consultant from the digital access team at Vision Australia. My role is to assist organisations in making their websites and apps accessible for people with disabilities. This is normally done through analysing a website or app while it's in development or after it's already been built. I then go through and identify and report these accessibility issues in quite a big report. and then I provide solutions for how to resolve those issues in the report as well. I'm not vision impaired, but use assistive technologies every day to help me find those accessibility issues. I also conduct training workshops in the field of digital accessibility, and I conduct user testing and also present at accessibility conferences around Australia. Back to you, Jess.
Great, thanks so much, everyone. We've got a really excellent panel for tonight. I want to let everyone know who's listening that tonight is an interactive session, and we do want to be able to try and answer as many of your questions as we can. If you do have any questions, please do send them through either using the chat function within Zoom, or you can also email them through to webinar@visionaustralia.org. That's webinar@visionaustralia.org. And also the final bit of housekeeping is just to let everyone know that tonight is being recorded, and the recording will be made available after the webinar. Right, so I think we're going to jump straight into it, and we're going to start by talking about some of the essential skills needed for accessing the digital world for people who are blind or low vision. And Damo, I'll get you to kick things off. Could you give us a bit of a broad outline of the sort of skills that people need to get started when accessing content or achieving daily tasks using web browsers and smartphone apps?
Sure. So I think one of the most important things is to have a level of familiarity and a level of comfort with the tools that you're using. So, you know, if you're a screen reader user, perhaps on a PC, and you're using NVDA or JAWS or perhaps VoiceOver on a Mac, you want to be familiar with as much of the operation of that tool as possible. In particular, things like how to navigate by headings and links and other different content types, how to navigate around dialogues and those sorts of things, and how to do that sort of quickly and efficiently, because some websites can have a lot of content. They can be very busy, lots of different types of elements on the screen. So it's really important that you know how to use some of those things. If you are using, for example, an iPhone, it might be, you know, understanding how to use VoiceOver, so how to type text into editable fields, how to use the rotor so that you can navigate again by heading, by link, you know, by identify form fields on a website, that sort of thing. If you're a magnification user, then knowing how to optimize the experience for what you're trying to do. So knowing how to adjust your magnification, how to select different color schemes and contrast settings and those sorts of things. But also probably knowing how to, the basics of sort of what can be done using the built-in accessibility in the browser. So sometimes we find, for example, that a site may not magnify particularly well using a dedicated magnifier like Windows Magnifier or Zoom Text, but you may be able to use the built-in zoom feature within the browser to increase the font size and those kinds of things. So having an understanding of those things, if you use both types of assistive technology, so both screen reader and magnifier, I guess knowing how to get the best out of those tools, and knowing perhaps when you might use speech to help you navigate more quickly, and when to use the visual aspects of the tools that you have. So I think that's a really important thing, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Mostly, I guess, so that you can, when you come across a barrier or you come across something that doesn't work well, you can identify whether it's a problem with the screen reader or the magnifier and the way it's interacting, or whether it's a problem with the website itself, or whether it's perhaps a problem with your browser. And I know we'll sort of touch on that a little bit later, but having those skills and a good understanding of your assistive tech and the tools that you're using really makes it a lot easier sometimes to diagnose what might be wrong and what you might be able to do next. If obviously we mentioned at the start of this webinar about the AT Help Desk, and part of my role is sort of managing that team, and we do get a number of queries around that and how to sort of do particular things with a screen reader or a magnifier. So don't forget that that option is there and is available to you as well if you need a little bit of support to get going, or a few hints and tips. The AT Help Desk service is there for you to access.
Thanks so much for that, Damien. So obviously it is a lot about knowing how to get the best out of your technology and how to go about doing that for you. Matt, when we're talking about accessibility, could you tell us a little bit more about some of the key guidelines and legislation that are in place regarding online accessibility and what people can reasonably expect when they are accessing the online world?
Sure, Jess. So the main guideline for ensuring people with disabilities can access the web is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is often abbreviated into WCAG. While these guidelines focus primarily on websites and mainly provide advice around websites, the same principles in it apply to mobile apps as well. So as far as the principles, there are four main ones that you should expect to be present on websites and apps. So the first principle to be aware of is perceivable. You should be able to perceive just about everything on that website or app. So that means, things like images, graphs, or diagrams should have text alternatives available. Multimedia should have captions and audio description where they're required. Content should also be able to be presented in different ways based on your user preferences, such as high contrast modes or text resizing and things like that. The second principle to be aware of is operable. You should be able to interact with all content in the website or app. So you should be able to navigate using a keyboard alone if you can't use a mouse, or you should be able to navigate using only your voice or using Braille. You should be able to navigate more than just using a mouse. Also, navigation for a website or app must be really clear. It should be obvious about where to go next and what you should do. And also, there shouldn't be much moving content on the website that can be distracting or very hard to read, or things that time out after a certain amount of time, like you only got a 15-minute time limit to complete that form. The third principle to be aware of is that instructions in the website or app need to be present and they need to be clear. So the website or app should be clear on what will happen when you interact with content. So if you check this checkbox, is it clear what's going to happen when that checkbox is checked? Sometimes you could suddenly reload the page when you check a checkbox, and if you didn't expect that to happen, that could be really, really confusing. Also, things like forms really need to be clear and obvious. They should be clearly labeled in the form, but also error messages in the form need to be readable and need to be findable, especially for screen reader users. And the last principle to be aware of is robust. And that means that your website or app should support a variety of different devices, operating systems, and assistive technologies. You should expect your screen reader or zoom tools or high contrast modes to all work. It's simply not good enough if they don't. Back to you, Jess.
Thank you so much for that, Matt. So it clearly is quite a complex area, and I think accessibility can really mean a lot of different things. Bruce, I'm wondering, through sort of your policy and systemic advocacy work, what has been your experience around online accessibility, and anything you can share with us on that?
Thanks, Jess. I'll begin by just mentioning that Vision Australia's advocacy team has produced a document called Stand Up for Your Rights. It's a series of documents actually, and there's one dealing with websites in particular, and we'll send a link around to that document. But it talks about how you go about advocating for web accessibility. But one of the things I've found over the years in my various roles is that when you encounter accessibility issues, and I guess by accessibility I mean when you come across something that you can't immediately use, then there is a variety of responses from website developers and app developers, and those app developers and website developers could be in government departments, they could be in major companies, or they could be in sort of small businesses. And you get a range of responses from those who are really keen to make their website or app as inclusive as possible, and will do whatever it takes fix any accessibility or usability issues that are reported to them. And all the way at the other end of the spectrum, you get web developers and app developers who really couldn't care less, and basically aren't going to make any effort at all to make their website or app accessible. And how you approach dealing with or contacting or liaising with website developers and app developers depends very much, I think, on the kind of initial response you get when you contact them and raise accessibility issues with them.
Thanks for that, Bruce. We have had a question that's come in from Sam, which I think might be a good one for you, Bruce, or you as well, Matt, because it's referring to some of the standards you were talking about before. So Sam has asked us, what are students' rights within universities to access digital information relating to education? The DDA seems to call out education in particular, but isn't particular about what WCAG standard universities should be held to. How binding is AHRC's 2014 DDA advisory notes?
Look, I'll open the batting on that one, and then Matt might want to sort of add.
Bruce.
Look, the Disability Discrimination Act is the key piece of Commonwealth legislation in Australia that expresses the rights of people with a disability. And the DDA makes it unlawful to discriminate against people on the grounds of disability in certain key areas of life. And one of those key areas is the provision of goods, services and facilities, and that includes websites. Another one is employment. Another one is access to the built environment. And another one, getting to Sam's question, is education. The DDA itself doesn't go into too many specifics about what unlawful discrimination means in particular contexts. It's very much a complaints-driven process. So if you feel you've been discriminated against, then you lodge a complaint, and the process proceeds from there. In certain areas, there have been standards developed which go into a lot more specific detail about what unlawful discrimination might mean and how to prevent it. And those standards have so far been developed in three areas. One is access to public transport, another one is access to premises, and another one is access to education. So there are DDA standards that deal with access to education, and those standards cover all education, right from the sort of the very beginning, KE, right up to post-secondary education, including universities. The standards, whilst they talk about the need for educational providers, including universities, to make reasonable adjustments in the way they provide information, and they don't go into specifics about, for example, whether universities should be complying with WCAG 2.0 or 2.1 or whatever it happens to be. Those standards are coming up for review later this year, and I'd encourage anyone who has an interest in the standards to provide input into that review if you think that the current standards are not sufficient enough. In relation to the Commission's Web Accessibility Advisory Notes, they are what they say they are. They're advisory. The Commission has always taken the view that if an organisation follows those notes, they are likely to, that will be taken into account in the event that a complaint against them is lodged under the DDA. But they certainly don't. They certainly don't have the force of law in the way that the DDA standards do and the DDA itself does. So Matt, is there anything else that you want to add to that?
That was really excellent, Bruce. The only thing I can say is, education websites or university websites are under the same sort of ruling when it comes to the WCAG standard level, which is WCAG 2.0 level AA. That standard was released in 2008 and has been an update in 2018 for WCAG 2.1. But as far as Australia-wide, government or non-government, you can be sued if the website is not WCAG 2.0 level AA conformant.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Bruce. And that was a really great question, Sam. Thank you for sending that through. We'll move on a little bit. So, Damien, I want to shoot over to you. When we're talking about barriers to online accessibility, I guess it's important to decipher whether what is being experienced is an actual accessibility barrier that other people are also experiencing, or if it's an issue with a user's experience or skills. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how we might be able to tell the difference?
It is difficult, and there aren't sort of too many easy answers on that, but there are a few things that you can try that might sort of help to clarify what's going on. So, I often use the analogy, if you were going to go and build a house, you wouldn't be able to do it with one sort of Allen key tool unless you bought the house as a kit from IKEA. So you would normally need a number of tools in your toolbox. And I think for most of us, that's sort of how we work. So in some cases, if I'm having difficulty accessing something with, for example, JAWS, I might try NVDA, or I might try accessing it with my iPhone using VoiceOver. I might change browsers. Sometimes I find that something will work well in Chrome but not in Firefox, or the other way around. So there is sort of a little bit of trial and error involved, and that's why I was sort of saying before that the importance of knowing how your screen reader behaves with different types of content, having the strategies for navigating through different types of content, understanding what it's doing, what it's telling you, those sorts of things are really important in order to determine, okay, is my screen reader functioning normally or not? Sometimes you might also perhaps seek some assistance from somebody else, or through social media, through various email lists and those sorts of things. You'll sometimes see people say, is anyone having issues with the checkout on the Woolworths or the Coles website, or something like that? And so asking around to see whether other people can reproduce the behavior will often tell you whether it's just something specific to your situation or your particular tool set, or whether it is a broader accessibility issue. So it's worth sort of doing a little bit of that trial and error before you start sort of contacting the developer or the person responsible for the website. While there's no easy answers, there are a few strategies that you can use, and that I frequently do use when I encounter something that's difficult to navigate. The other thing you can do sometimes is, like, some websites will have, for example, a site that's optimized for a mobile browser and that kind of thing. Sometimes they can be a little bit easier to navigate or a little less graphical. So sometimes that can be an option as well.
Thanks, Damo. Bruce, I know just on what Damo's talking about in terms of having to sometimes have a bit of trial and error with different pieces of technology, you had a recent experience with some online shopping where you had to try a couple of different ways to go about it.
That's right, Jess. I over the last couple of months, my mattress has started to sag, and so every time you lie on it, the springs make loud twanging noises, and it has nothing to do with the fact that I've acquired a few extra kilos over the last couple of months. But I decided I needed to buy a new mattress, and that process was an interesting process in itself. I think I'm an expert now on mattress websites, and the ones that are accessible or usable and the ones that aren't. But I then needed, obviously, to buy some sheets for it, and I went on to a particular website last week to find some sheets. Found a brand of bamboo cotton blend sheets that were wrinkle free, so you don't need to iron them, and went to add them to the shopping cart, and then found I had to select the size, and whether it's king, queen, double, whatever. And I then discovered I opened the combo box in JAWS and couldn't select any of the sizes. JAWS just said there was nothing there, and I knew there must be something there, because it wouldn't be asking me to select a size if there were no sizes to select. I suppose because I've been around for a long time and I've become familiar with different browsers and different assistive technologies. I was able to kind of experiment with JAWS, with different browsers, and also with Windows Narrator, and a little bit with NVDA. And I found eventually that Narrator was the only assistive technology that would let me actually select the size on this particular website. Now, there's a couple of things to say. Firstly, there was clearly something wrong with that website, because if it complied with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, then JAWS would be able to navigate that particular combo box, and probably in all the various browsers, Chrome, Edge, Chrome Canary, sort of Internet Explorer, Firefox, whatever. And the fact that it couldn't means there's something wrong with that website. The advantage of being able to kind of play around with different browsers and different technologies was that you can often find some combination that works, which allows you to get the job done, which in this case for me was buying a pair of sheets. I wasn't particularly interested in the time in doing advocacy with the particular website developer. I wanted to buy some sheets, and this allowed me to do it. Not everyone is in the position of being able to kind of experiment with those different browsers, and you shouldn't really have to. But as as in many areas of life, it's often a question of balancing the need to get something done versus the importance of raising awareness about accessibility among businesses and web developers.
Thanks, Bruce. And we will touch on that in a little bit, everyone, a little bit more on how to go about contacting organisations when you do come across an issue. So we will circle back to that. We have had a question come in from Nicole. Matt, maybe for you. Nicole has asked, are there specific accessibility standards for video conferencing software such as Zoom that differ from the standards for websites?
There is an ICT accessibility standard, which is more for just general desktop applications like Zoom. However, it has no real weight in legislation or anything like that. So it's very similar to what WCAG has. So you could even look at WCAG and apply it to Zoom, and apply the same principles of WCAG to Zoom and improve it that way. But yeah, at the moment, there's just no real concrete sort of legislation to really force Zoom to make their desktop apps accessible.
Great, thanks, Matt, and thanks, Nicole, for that question. So like I said, we do want to touch a little bit more on how you can go about contacting organisations when you have experienced an accessibility issue with their website. And I think we have got a question that's related to this as well from someone that has sent one in, which is great. So Matt, if we can go back to you again, what would your advice be for people around contacting organisations regarding accessibility issues with their website or app? Sort of who's best to talk to, and how should you go about addressing the issue with them?
Sure. So some organizations have a direct accessibility or website feedback channel at the Contact Us webpage, or sometimes there's an accessibility statement on their website. Usually you can find it in the footer. That sort of has a link or an email that you can go to. And some organizations don't have this though, or they just have a contact form that is inaccessible in itself. So you cannot actually complete the contact us form to contact them about the accessibility issue, which is ridiculous, but that's how it is. So sometimes you need to go through more general sort of inquiry contact emails, or even just a general phone number. And then you're going to get on the other end someone who probably doesn't know a lot about accessibility as likely what's going to happen. So one good way to do it is to just call out the organization on social media if you have access to it. Organizations don't like bad press and are more likely to pay attention to your issue if it's out there in the public for everyone to see. There is also a guide from the W3C about contacting in websites of organizations with inaccessible websites, which I'll link right now in the chat. And there's also the Vision Australia Self-Advocacy Guide, which provides a lot of similar information. In summary, both of those articles say to keep your feedback to the organization very calm and clear. Don't try to get angry at them and yell at them, because that, in my experience as well, has always led to a really negative outcome. So try your best to describe the problem that you're facing on the website or app. Try to include things like where exactly defined the issue on the website or app, what the actual problem is you're facing, and what device and assistive technology you're using as well. That's really important so that their developers or designers can actually replicate the same issue that you're experiencing, and provide details about what your goal was, what you were trying to do, and why it was difficult or impossible to do it. In some cases, the organization may give you an alternative way of achieving your goal if the website or app doesn't actually work. So that's what I recommend you try and do.
Thank you so much, Matt. And as Matt mentioned, we do have a self-advocacy guide that does relate to this, which we will send out following the webinar. Damo, I just wanted to go over to you. In terms of when you do contact an organisation, I guess a common problem that we hear about is people having difficulties telling the person on the phone what the actual issue is when they're using a screen reader. So how can you best sort of explain, I guess, to a sighted person who's on the other end of the line, what your screen reader is showing you and how for them to best assist you?
So you're referring, I'm assuming, to a situation where the person says, oh, well, you should be able, up in the top left-hand corner, there should be a link there that says whatever.
That's exactly right, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess the important thing is to, when you're in that situation, to explain that sometimes the screen reader renders the page in a way that makes it sort of make sense when you're using that technology, but it doesn't necessarily replicate spatially where things are on the screen. So what I normally do in that situation is I'll say to them, look, my screen reader doesn't sort of indicate to me exactly whereabouts on the screen the link is that you're talking about, or the content is that you're referring to. Can you tell me what the link is called, or something about the text? And then I might use my screen reader's find function to locate that text. So yes, it's always worth explaining to the person on the other end of the phone that the way it's displayed visually on the screen is not necessarily how it would appear to a screen reader user.
Great, thanks, Damo. And Matt, just to go back to what you were saying before, we have had somebody ask what's the title of the ITC framework that you referenced before?
Oh, sure. I'll have to look that up, but I will link it in the chat.
No worries. Thanks, Matt. So we're going to slightly change topics a little bit and move on to discussing the recent smartphone research that Vision Australia has been involved in, which Bruce has been heavily involved in. So Bruce, are you able to sort of tell us a little bit more and give us a bit of an overview of that research and what it has uncovered?
Yes, thank you, Jess. Very happy to do that. Look, on my desk, here at home, where I've been working since sort of middle of March, I have a Telstra touch phone T200, and I've had it for, I think, about 30 years. And what it does really well. That is, it answers calls and it lets me make calls. But I have to say, it's not all that smart. It doesn't do anything other than make and receive phone calls, and it was never designed to do that, to do anything more, because back when the T200 came out, that was what phones did, and it has done it and still does it, extremely well. But smartphones have now become a part of our life, beginning really with Apple's iPhone in 2007, which wasn't the first version of which wasn't accessible at all, but which they subsequently made accessible beginning in 2009. So smartphones are now really pretty much a standard piece of communications sort of technology that many people have. And by a smartphone, I mean something that generally has a touch screen, not always, but most of the time has a touch screen, and more particularly something that allows you to not just make phone calls and receive phone calls, but send and receive text messages, check your email, use apps to do various things like check the weather, do online shopping, book taxis, and so forth. Now, as many of you in this webinar would know, people who are blind or have low vision are now using smartphones too, and have been using smartphones since 2009, when the iPhone 3GS included the voiceover and Zoom screen readers. In 2015, Vision Australia did a little research to look at how people who are blind or have low vision were using smartphones, and we had at that stage 500 participants in a survey that we conducted, and what we found was that overall only 17% of the blind and low vision community was using smartphones, and that low figure was heavily influenced by the fact that smartphone usage declined very much with age. And so in the 19 to 34 age group, 86% of people were using smartphones, but by the time you get to the 75 and plus age group, only 2.8% of people were using smartphones. Fast forward to, or rewind now to 2019, and a lot has changed. And one of the things that has changed is that smartphones have become even more widespread and even more sort of prominent in most aspects of life than they were in 2015. You know, taxis are now increasingly being booked through smartphones. You can order takeaway food through Uber Eats, and you can only do that through a smartphone. The Australian government's newest credential called MyGov ID, not to be confused with MyGov. MyGov ID can only be obtained using a smartphone. Banks now, sort of many people do their banking using smartphones. So we thought it's important for our advocacy and just for our general understanding of our community to get a better sense of how people who are blind or have low vision are using smartphones. And so we developed a proposal which we submitted to a number of research institutions last year, and Curtin University was the successful tenderee. And so we have been working with Curtin University earlier this year to conduct some updated research on how people who are blind or have low vision are using smartphones. We wanted to get as much information as we reasonably could, so we designed a fairly comprehensive SurveyMonkey survey, which was offered by phone and online between early February and late March 2020. And we sort of collected data about people's age, degree of vision impairment, their geographical location, like, you know, metro versus regional versus rural, whether people had additional disabilities, whether they used apps that have been specifically designed for people who are blind or have low vision, how often people use their smartphones, the types of tasks that people use their phones for, a wish list for future apps, and suggestions for how you know, what Vision Australia can do in the smartphone space. Altogether, we had 841 respondents to this survey, compared with 500 in 2015. And whereas and 632 of those people participated by phone when they were contacted by the research assistants from Curtin. Now, in 2015, as I mentioned before, overall we found that 17% of people who are blind or have low vision were using smartphones. In 2020, that figure is now 78%. So there's been a very significant increase. And the main reason that there's been such a significant increase is that people in older age groups are using smartphones much more now than in 2015. By and large, the 18 to 34-year-old, we've got 90, almost 100% of people who are blind or have low vision in that age group are using smartphones. It doesn't drop below 90% until you get to the 65 to 74 age group, where it still only drops to 78%. So that's up from 25% in 2015. And the oldest age group that we surveyed, which was the 85 plus, and now there's 31% of people in that age group are now using smartphones, which is up from 28 from 2.8%. So whilst it's still obviously much less than the 100% that we get for younger age groups, it's still a significant increase, and it does have implications for how we go about advocacy in the future. Another interesting thing is that 30% of participants in the survey said they had additional disabilities, and 28% of those referred to hearing impairment. And that's important in situations like where we might be sort of advocating for a more accessible alternative than capture, the kind of the I'm not a robot boxes that you get on websites that often have audio alternatives, but even an audio alternative is not going to be of much use to people that have got hearing impairments. 76% of people who responded to the survey are using iPhones, and only 24% are using Androids, and the most common Android phone people are using is Samsung. And that's interesting because Android accessibility has come a long way since 2015, but at least based on the results of our research, that hasn't translated into significantly greater usage of Android phones by people who are blind or have low vision, and that may well be because Apple got the accessibility sort of included first, and many people have seen Apple as a leader and still do in accessibility. Just to kind of quickly talk about a few of the key findings. There are many findings, and so I'll just try and pick out a few that I think might be of interest to people. 84% of people who are using smartphones are using them sort of throughout the day. They don't just use them maybe once a week or sort of even in the morning. They're using them throughout the day. So smartphone usage in the blind and low vision community is really not a luxury anymore. It's almost I guess a necessity, and that's become particularly relevant during the recent COVID-19 pandemic. The Curtin researchers are in the process now of conducting some more in-depth interviews with some people looking at how their smartphone usage has been affected by COVID-19. And one of the things that's emerging is that people who were comfortable using their smartphones before COVID-19 are using them more during COVID-19, and people who weren't comfortable using their smartphones before COVID-19 are finding sort of increasing challenges trying to sort of become more comfortable, because sometimes during the pandemic, using a smartphone has been a key way for people to stay connected. As you'd expect, the sort of almost 100% of people use their phones to make phone calls and receive texts, and 86% emails, and 57% of people who use smartphones use them to do banking. The number drops a bit for booking taxis and getting around in the community, 41%, and surfing the web, 47% of people who are using smartphones and are using those smartphones to surf the web. As you might expect, listening to music and radio and podcasts, 56%, so there's quite a lot of people using their phones for that. Checking the weather is 52%. I'm one of those. I'm always asking Siri and Google what the weather is, and I often ask them both at the same time and let them fight it out. Over 50% of people use apps that are specifically designed for people who are blind or have low vision, and the most commonly used category of apps are the sort of the AI type apps like, Seeing AI, and they're closely followed by GPS apps like Blind Square, although a lot of people who use their phones for getting around in the community use things like Google Maps and Apple Maps. One of the things that is interesting is that of the people that used apps that have been specifically designed for people who are blind or have low vision, 38% said that they were difficult to use, and 35% said that they weren't fully accessible. So I think that there's a message here for for app developers. Damo mentioned before about the Vision Australia AT help desk, and it's good to know that 21% who have difficulty with apps do contact our AT help desk. So I'd encourage you, if you are having difficulty with apps, to contact our help desk, because they may they'll be able to assist you. At the moment, there's a comprehensive report that's being produced by Curtin University, and that report will be available once it's sort of finalised. It will be available on Vision Australia's website. In the meantime, I'm very happy to answer questions, have discussions by email or phone. If you have, if you want further information or have any questions. So look, I think that's it for me, Jess, by way of a hopefully interesting overview.
Thank you, Bruce. And we did get a question relating to if the research will be publicly available. So I'm sure we'll send out communications when it is. Is that right, Bruce? That's
absolutely right. Yes, it will certainly be publicly available. I'm not quite sure when at this stage, because the final report would include the results of the interviews that are currently being done around smartphone usage during COVID-19. But when it is available, as I said, it will be on the website. We'll make sure it's promoted during through all our usual channels, and it'll be. I certainly encourage everyone to read it.
Great, thanks, Bruce. So we have had a question come in that probably you could all answer for us, but particularly maybe you, Bruce, and you, Damo, as well. So Sean has said, is the statement touchscreen technology is not accessible now invalid, or does it depend on the platform the touchscreen is built upon? What do you think about that, Bruce? Anything to say to that?
Look, I think it's a bit like saying how long is a piece of string. It sort of really, I think, really does depend on the context. Most statements that include the word accessible do depend on context, and touchscreen technology has been a particularly context dependent area. We don't have standards governing the accessibility of touchscreens in the way that we do, for example, through for the web content accessibility guidelines. We do have guidelines, but I think people who use the iPhone would say that touchscreen interface is highly usable because of the work that Apple has done. Someone who has never held a touchscreen device in their hand would certainly find it more difficult to use initially, but I think that the statement is one that I probably would not make myself, because I think the whole area of touchscreens is complex.
Yeah, very, very big area. I think you're right there, Bruce. Damo, I mean, you're a voiceover user yourself. What's sort of been your experience with surfing the web on your phone?
I do obviously use my phone for all manner of things. anything from sort of navigation to, shopping to email, all the things that Bruce sort of mentioned, and probably some others, including using my phone as an audio recording device and all kinds of things. And yeah, it really depends on what I'm doing and where I am as to what I use, which tool I use and why. If I'm doing something where I'm going to be typing a lot of content into fields and things like that, if I'm at home, I'll generally just pick up the laptop, because I just find using the keyboard quicker for some things. But then for other things, because like if I want to access something during my commute, have a look at the news or something like that, then obviously I'll do that from my phone. I travel quite a lot, and as a result of that, I spend a lot of time stuck in airport lounges and motels and things like that. And so a lot of the time it's easier to just grab my phone out. So I tend to, as I sort of mentioned, I think before, it's one of a number of tools that I tend to use to get the job done. And it really depends on what job I'm doing and where I'm doing it as to, where I use my phone.
Thanks, Damo. So I think, as you said, Bruce, there's almost half of smartphone users who are blind or low vision do use their phones to surf the web. So Matt, sort of from your experience, how does surfing with Safari and VoiceOver or Zoom compare to surfing with a screen reader like JAWS in terms of accessibility and compliance with the guidelines? I'm sorry, Matt. I don't think I can actually hear you. Damo, Bruce, can you hear Matt?
No,
I'm back now.
Oh, you're back.
I'll
Great.
start again. Sorry.
I just wanted to check it wasn't me. Sorry about that, Matt. If you could just start again.
No worries. So VoiceOver screen reader for iPhone or TalkBack screen reader for Android, I find at least are generally much easier to learn and use compared to NVDA and JAWS. There's a lot less sort of keystrokes you need to learn, and with a touch screen, you've just got some certain gestures that you need to learn, and that's really about it as far as learning how to use the screen reader. That being said, there are some issues which more commonly come up on an app compared to a website, and some of those things include accessing the main menu on an app or even a mobile version of a website, as these are often hidden in a little menu button until you expand open the menu. So if that menu button is inaccessible, then guess what? You're not going to be getting into the main menu of that website or app. Also, buttons being unlabeled is much more common in apps compared to websites. And also, it's much more common that just generally things in apps just won't be readable at all, which is more common than websites as well. However, I find that when websites are made well, when the app developer actually goes through the effort of making a really accessible app, they're usually far simpler and easier to use than even a fully accessible website. There's usually apps are designed to be more simple, so it's a lot less annoying stuff to sort of go through as you're going through the app. I feel in that way that websites can learn a lot from the design of apps and actually applying sort of the same principles of simple and easy design to websites as well. Also, when I conduct accessibility reports and I send them to a website developer versus an app developer, I find that app developers are way better at actually resolving accessibility issues than website developers. It's often the case with an app developer, I just need to tell them, oh yeah, VoiceOver should act in this way. And they'll go, oh yeah, and they know what to do and they know how to fix it. Whereas a website developer has no idea. They sort of don't know what I'm talking about, and I need to really drill down to the code and say, you need to make this exact change to this line of code for the thing to work. And even then they get it wrong sometimes. So yeah, that is my experience, at least, with the difference between websites and apps.
Thanks, Matt. We did have someone ask a little bit earlier, and this is probably pretty quick question, but either for you, Damo, or Matt. Can the VA help desk assist? Like, is it worthwhile contacting the VA help desk around app difficulties where the site is unhelpful? This person has mentioned that they did contact the company or I believe the help desk of the company and didn't really get anywhere. Can VA help with that at all?
Probably not through the AT help desk.
Yeah.
You know, we can certainly, if someone sort of contacts us and says, look, we're struggling with accessing this website or this app, do you have any tips or ideas? Then someone in the team, if they don't already know the app, will install it and have a look and try to sort of provide some workarounds or some tips. But I guess the help desk themselves are not really equipped to do the advocacy piece and sort of contact the organisation on our client's behalf.
Okay.
You know, I suppose their primary function is tech support, perhaps more so than advocacy.
Okay, great. Thanks, Damo. And Bruce, we've just got a couple of minutes left, but in terms of all the discussion we are having around the smartphones and apps and what have you, with the research that you have been involved in, once that does come out, do you know how it might impact the systemic advocacy that Vision Australia does do in the digital space?
It's a question that we're sort of considering very closely at the moment, Jess, because 52% of the people who participated in the smartphone survey did say that they'd like Vision Australia to do more advocacy around the accessibility of apps and around the availability of funding for smartphones. So certainly it's an area that we are considering. I think one of the things that we will emphasize more is, instead of a lot of emphasis on it's important to have parallel access sort of streams. For example, sort of Uber Eats, you can only order with a smartphone, and similarly certain types of government services and other things you can only use with a smartphone. We have emphasised a lot over the past few years to companies, look, you need to recognise the fact that not everyone uses smartphones. And that's still true, because not everyone does, and so we won't stop saying that. But the reality is that Uber is not going to suddenly introduce a new way of ordering of Uber Eats that doesn't require a smartphone. So one of the things we have to, I think, focus increasingly on is making sure that companies like Uber, Woolworths, sort of Coles, whoever, develop apps that are compliant with standards and guidelines, so that they are usable by the increasing number of people who are blind or have low vision, who are using sort of smartphones. So we still want to emphasize universal sort of access and inclusion, but we also want to focus, I think, more on than we have in the past on making sure that the smartphone stream is accessible when usable.
Great, thank you so much, Bruce. We have come to the end. We do have quite a few questions that have come in, which we unfortunately haven't been able to get to. But if you have sent through a question that we haven't answered, please do send it through to webinar@visionaustralia.org, and either Damo, Bruce, Matt, or someone else will be able to answer that for you. So as I said, please do send through any questions you may have to webinar@visionaustralia.org. So as I said, we have come to the end, and thank you, Matt, Bruce and Damo. It was a really great discussion about quite a broad topic that definitely we could talk about for a lot longer than an hour, but we really appreciate the insight that you've all provided. And I want to also thank everyone who has taken the time to tune in. It's been great to have you all here. And again, thank you for all the really great questions. And that'll be all for tonight, guys. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Jess, and thank you, Bruce and Damo, for inviting me on.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, the other panelists. It's been a great webinar to participate in.
Thanks, folks, for the opportunity to talk to you. Appreciate it.
Thanks all. See you later.